Good. Good morning, or actually afternoon, everyone. My name's Peter Smallage. I'm the New York State Extension Forester, and I run the program that I run is called Forest Connect, and one element of that is a monthly webinar series that's been going on now since 2007. So it's been a lot of fun. Some of you have been around many times. I recognize your names. I appreciate your continued presence. And it's because we have really good and fun presenters that have some great topics, and today is no different. Today we're joined by Dr. Colin Beyer, who's an associate professor in the Department of Sustainable Resource Management at the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry in Syracuse. And I know many of you are, as myself, graduates of SUNY ESF. Colin's broadly trained as a forest ecologist, has expertise in how ecosystems and landscapes function, how these ecosystems provide benefits and support human well-being, and a variety of other ecosystem function relationships. Colin's also the founding director of the Climate and Applied Forest Research Institute, known as CAFRE. CAFRE is a consortium of forest, climate, and energy experts at SUNY ESF in the Cornell College of Ag and Life Sciences. He's the principal investigator of long-term ecosystem monitoring programs at ESF's Huntington Research Forest in the Adirondacks. He hails from the South. He has a master's degree, a Master of Science from Virginia Tech, and a PhD from the University of Fairbanks in Alaska. He resides in Syracuse. So Colin, I want to thank you for joining us today. I saw Colin and I did a little preview a couple of days ago. He's got some very cool things he's going to share with us, and I am going to call if you want to go ahead and share your screen, and I am going to mute, and it's all yours. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Peter. Real pleasure to join you. I appreciate you thinking of me and for Forest Connect. And I appreciate all the folks joining us from all around the country. So I'm going to jump right into this in talking about the mapping and monitoring of forest carbon benefits. And this is largely related to an ongoing project that we've been doing in partnership with Department of Environmental Conservation, New York State, DEC, both the Office of Climate Change and the Division of Lands and Forests. And this is meant to give an overview of some of the issues without getting into too much of the weeds of the technical details of this work, which is always very challenging for me because I want to show you all the work behind everything. But I'm going to try to focus on the big picture here and what some of the deliverables and outputs are. And I'll mention that a few times, but I want to mention it now that I'm happy to obviously answer questions and follow up with any and all around some of the technical details on this, particularly the how we've done this analysis and modeling. But again, what I've tried to focus on here is the big picture and really the outputs of this and how we might use it and some of the things that we've addressed and where we're headed in the future. So with that, I really like this animation, really talking about how the climate change challenge and the issue of climate change is really an issue about carbon. It's about the emissions of greenhouse gases, and particularly carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And what this animation shows, and I've borrowed this, but this shows the progression of monitoring atmospheric carbon dioxide since beginning at Mauna Loa, which is the red dot there in Hawaii, since 1979. And what the wiggly line on the left is showing is the gradual increases in the parts per million of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere. All the little dots are various places that are starting to pop up where this is being sampled, where this is being monitored. The blue dot is down in Antarctica. On the right-hand side, what this is showing as we click through time here on a monthly basis is that increase that many of us are familiar with seeing, this up and down. You can see the up and down in that red line really is kind of the Earth breathing in CO2. This has a lot to do with the seasonal dynamics of our temperate and boreal forests, absorbing carbon dioxide during the productive times of year, and not doing so during the dormant times of year. And in 1989, I remember, as a student, as hearing about 350 parts per million being a big deal. And of course, as of 2017, and now it's 406, and now we've reached about 430 parts per million. What this animation is doing is also going to take us back in time a bit further, and very quickly you see that hockey stick. That axis is going back to 800, 500 years Anno Domini, and giving us a sense of the climate under these conditions. And essentially what this says is, when we had ice ages, the Earth's atmosphere had about 185 parts per million carbon dioxide. Before the Industrial Revolution, we were about 280, and we've seen rapid increases all the way pushed to the right of this graph that's moving. The rapid increases that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution and since our use of fossil energy primarily. And you can see that there's fluctuation in Earth's climate, and there always has been. But that the climate change issue that we face now is really about the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And this is just showing all of the folks that contributed to this pretty incredible animation, and all of the different data and all of the different groups that's been collaborated and pulled together by Andy Jacobson at NOAA, who does amazing work. Forests, of course, remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And because of that, they're carbon sinks. And what this animation is just showing is the way that carbon flows through these systems. And just basics, most of you know this, but just to cover these basics, forests remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in a process called sequestration, and they store this carbon in living trees, in dead wood, leaf litter, and in soils. There's flows of carbon also that pass through the soil and dissolved organic matter and dissolved organic carbon into our surface waters. By removing and storing carbon, by taking it out of the atmosphere, forests provide what we might call negative emissions, and those directly reduce climate risk. The amount of carbon that a forest sequesters and stores is really shaped by a lot of local conditions, right? One of the mantras in forest ecology is "it depends." These are incredibly complex systems, and there's a lot of legacy of the past that influences what a forest does today, and the present also influences what a forest might do in the future. And there's a tremendous amount of variation that you can find out in the world, obviously, related to the age of the site, the age of the forest, the quality of the site in terms of soils and climate, the types of trees that you find, and the disturbance history, and where the forest might be in recovery from disturbance or even experiencing disturbance ongoing. When we convert forests to other land uses like residential developments or agriculture, the land loses the carbon stored in the soils for the most part. Now, depending on the conversion and what the next use is, such as agriculture, there still can be carbon stored in the soils. But typically, there's really no other land use, and particularly in North America, that stores more carbon per unit area, per acre, than a forest. And it's going to lose a lot of its capacity for future sequestration and storage if we convert that forest land into a different type of land use. Because of this, it's been increasingly recognized that forests provide climate solutions. And both the US National Academy of Science and the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, agree that natural carbon sinks, especially those provided by forests, are amongst the lowest cost and most immediate solutions. And some of the jargon that's used by IPCC and they look at these different sectors and different strategies. They talk about agriculture, forestry, and other land use, or AFOLU, and that includes reforestation and improved forest management. And of course, protecting the forest that exists now, trying to avoid any loss of forest land or deforestation. They also talk a lot about bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, which tends to be more controversial. But this is the idea of generating renewable feedstocks for energy and other materials, renewable non-fossil, and those systems that have relatively low or zero net carbon dioxide emissions. In the scenarios that IPCC has laid out for how we try to avoid or max out the warming on the planet to about 1.5 degrees Celsius, which most recently kind of backed off of, and now we're moving to 2 degrees Celsius. But in these scenarios that have been worked out, there's a lot of reduction of our fossil emissions, which is shown in gray, but the ag and forestry, and particularly the forestry piece of this, which is shown in brown, is a very important part of these scenarios. It is integral to all 4 scenarios under which we actually are able to reverse this trend and start to actually remove a net amount of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And so forests are central to solving the climate issue. And so what's emerged from in the last several years is this notion of natural climate solutions as conservation, restoration, and management activities that increase carbon storage on the land and avoid or reduce emissions from natural and working lands, including forests, farms, and wetlands. And the forest-based strategies for this are very broadly speaking, reforestation, which is adding new forest land. This can be active or passive. There's avoided forest conversion, which basically means don't lose the forest that you have, play defense, protect the forest lands that you do have. And the third, which embodies a lot of different things and is very context specific, both biophysically and socially in terms of the landowner and the community and the landscape that they're in, is through natural forest management and through adjusting or improving management practices in ways that enhance the carbon benefits on working lands. And at the same time, through that management and stewardship activity, hopefully help forests adapt to the rapidly changing environment that we're seeing. Nature Conservancy has been a really integral group in much of this work in terms of natural climate solutions assessments. And roughly speaking, they have estimated that forests are going to do the vast majority of this work, right? Forests already are sequestering carbon, so it's about dialing that up, as opposed to agriculture and other land uses, which tend to be emitters of greenhouse gases. And the goal there is to try to reduce those emissions as much as possible. What this graphic is just showing is the equivalent in terms of the amount of cars that you might effectively be taking off the road in terms of emissions, and seeing that forests are doing roughly twice what even improving agriculture might do and many other habitats. The Forest Service with the National Forest Inventory estimates that currently the amount of carbon stored in US forests equates to about 67 years of cumulative fossil fuel emissions based on the 2018 rates of emissions. And on an annual basis, the forests offset about 15% of annual emissions based on their growth and the expansion of US forests. And this 15% is an interesting number, and one that is very relevant to the situation we have here in New York, which is, some of you know, and many may not, that in 2019, New York State passed the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which amongst other things mandates a net zero emissions New York economy by the year 2050. What's estimated there is that they're targeting to reduce or eliminate 85% of the emissions that exist in the state based on 1990 standards. That's the benchmark for the 85%. The other 15% is considered to be difficult, or if not impossible, to eliminate. Some examples of these kinds of things would be things like jet fuel. or other types of very difficult to decarbonize sectors. The state is essentially looking at its forests to provide this 15% offset. And based on what FIA is telling us for New York State, this means more than doubling the size or strength of the New York State carbon sink, the forest carbon sink, by 2050, and not just getting it to that point by 2050, but holding it there in perpetuity beyond 2050. And this is a very tall order for our forest lands. This has led to a very urgent need to be able to assess our forest carbon. Now, FIA already does this, as I mentioned, and does this with the National Forest Inventory plot network. But there's some limitations to that system. And one of the fundamental limitations to it is that the data, the plots that represent roughly about 6,000 acres each on the landscape. And when you do samples at these points across these landscapes, each plot is about 30 kilometers from each other, you get a great sample for a large area. You can aggregate that information up to a state level, even sometimes even a county level. But what FIA can't provide is a small area estimation basis, and it can't give you specific, spatially explicit or map-based geographic information about how forest carbon changes or varies over space, and how then those spatial patterns might be changing over time. And that has driven the objective here, which we're working on with DEC and others, to develop a map-based carbon accounting system to inform policy regulatory actions, as well as parcel level forest stewardship activities. As I mentioned, the FIA reports state level estimates of stocks and changes to the EPA based on a statistical analysis of their field plot networks. They've got over 4,400 plots located across New York State alone. And this is the gold standard, platinum standard globally in terms of a national forest inventory, a very robust system for sampling. And when you look at stocks and trends at a state level, they're useful, but they offer relatively little actionable information at the scales that are most relevant for decision making, as well as insights on why or where or how the forest carbon sink might be changing. And so recognizing some of the limitations to take what FIA can provide at a very high level and move it towards decision making at the scales that decisions are made. We set out to create a map-based inventory of current forest carbon stocks that is statewide or wall-to-wall, high resolution and accurate enough to provide reliable estimates scaling from a parcel level to a state and regional level. We also wanted to create a system for using the field plots and satellite data to estimate how carbon stocks have changed since 1990, which gives us a sense of sequestration and the net emissions and removals of the forest sector, and to monitor forest carbon stock changes across the state from now going forward. So we need to both be able to look backward in time and forward in time and understand how things are changing. And this is a very applied project with deliverables including data maps and tools for supporting public and private sector decision-making, policy-making, planning, and so forth. And so this is a significant task to essentially translate the existing carbon accounting system based on FIA into a map space and into a space where we have a lot more information to make decisions and understand what's going on out there. The work that CAFRE is doing is to map current forest biomass and carbon stocks, to estimate recent pattern of changes in carbon stocks, and monitor future patterns of changes in carbon stocks for all of New York State. And this graph you'll see a few times, or this graphic you'll see a few times, which really tries to summarize what we're doing. And I'm going to walk you through some of the different pieces of this as we go. And again, at a very high level, without a lot of the kind of scientific nitty-gritty details in terms of the methods, as well as the very extensive amount of work that we do to evaluate the accuracy and uncertainty associated with these models. I'll give you some brief information on that. You'll have to take my word for it. But as I mentioned before, I'm happy to get into the details with folks either during the question session afterwards or in separate conversations. So first of all, we need to map what's out there now. And the question there is, what are the current forest biomass and carbon stocks and where are they located? We do this with a combination of the field inventory information and remote sensing data. And particularly in this case, we're relying most on Lidar, or light distance and ranging, or also known as airborne laser scanning. This application is essentially, the laser scanning is the same technology or similar technology as what gets you a speeding ticket when the cops shoot the radar gun at you. And basically when that laser drops down from the plane, right, it's bouncing back from the ground as well as from the forest canopy. And it gives us a lot of detailed structural information about the forest, which when we look at the Lidar imagery or the Lidar data over forest plots, inventory plots, we can relate those two things together with machine learning models. So when we look at Lidar in relation to FIA plot layouts, there's some different ways to associate the Lidar point cloud information, which is shown in this kind of rainbow colored. You can see the individual subplots kind of punched out like a hole punch, or the whole area around the actual sampled subplots, which I'm calling the super plot here. But essentially what this returns to us is a lot of information that you could visualize in the way that I've shown you here. But this is a lot of information that we can use to try to map or to try to model the characteristics of the plot. Particularly what we're interested in is the above ground biomass of the plots. We can use the above ground biomass that we model to then estimate carbon stocks, with the exception of soils, which is a whole different can of worms, which we could talk about later. For New York State, there's a real patchwork of Lidar that's available. Virtually all of this has been flown by federal agencies, and it was flown leaf off, which seems like a deal breaker, but in fact, leaf off Lidar actually gives us better estimates of above ground biomass because we get a better ground return signal. And this patchwork of Lidar, these different coverages that are shown in the upper left map, is flown at different times with different sensors, and there's a lot of work we have to do to stitch this patchwork together. On the bottom right, what is showing is Lidar that's forthcoming. Since I put the slide together, we actually just recently got the yellow area, the Central Finger Lakes coverage. We're still waiting on this big gray area, which particularly includes Hamilton County up in the Adirondacks, which is an area where we have a lot of forested FIA plots we're looking forward to getting. Essentially, and I'll show you later, this all fits together. But the lack of Lidar that's consistent across the whole state for the same time period has created a number of challenges that we've overcome to the best of our ability. And I won't get into the weeds there, but it also has led to us trying some other things. I just want to show you really quickly, and hopefully Bruce and Mike at Huntington Forest in Newcomb will appreciate some of this imagery. This is just to give you a sense of the kinds of things that Lidar can give us back. What both of these maps are showing is two different parts of the border of Huntington Forest, which is kind of on the right-hand side of this dividing line that you can see. And what this is a canopy height model. And going from blue, which is 0 in elevation, up to about 38 meters in height. And you can see the individual tree crowns in this data. And you can also see where the property line is between Huntington Forest and the adjacent working forest lands that were formerly managed by Finch Prine and are currently managed by F&W Forestry Services, part of the Upper Hudson Woodlands. This was land that changed hands right around the time that I got to New York. And you can see the skid trails in the map on the bottom right and in the lower left-hand side of that map. You can also see the highway, you can see the lake, you can see a lot of details and a lot of information around forest structure as in the context of the landscape. This is an area on the south end of I believe Skinny Atlas Lake, or no, I apologize. I think it's Cayuga Lake. And this is showing, again, the LIDAR blue being low elevation or low height and going up into yellow and red as a taller vegetation structure. And this gives us a great amount of detail. So mapping the landscape in 3D teaches us quite a bit. We can leverage that information into producing maps like this. So again, there's a lot of details behind this, but I've skipped over that just to get to I guess the good stuff, which is really to show how we translate all of this information into being able to map above ground biomass across very large areas. So this is, I'm going to show you maps for the 4 kind of areas that we used as pilot areas or sandboxes for developing these models. And testing these models, we use data from everywhere we could to train and test these models. But this is a portion of the Adirondacks, including Huntington Forest and portions of the High Peaks Wilderness, as well as Lake George in the southeastern area there. This is a very different landscape, Cayuga, Oswego County, in an area in the Finger Lakes where you can see a lot less forest, with the exception of the northern part of this as you start to get into the Tug Hill region. In the southern tier, in the Allegheny and Steuben counties, you can see more forest, but very highly fragmented in some areas. This area actually contains the highest biomass FIA plot that we have in the whole state. But there's actually quite a bit of forest in this region, as many of you probably know. And this shows the lower Hudson Valley, including Dutchess, Orange, and Ulster counties. And that real contrast between the heavily developed lower Hudson and the Catskills and the Forest Preserve in the upper left-hand or kind of northwestern part of this area. So these maps their pixel resolution is 30 by 30 meters on the ground. And that matches the resolution of a lot of other remote sensing products like land cover data sets, like Landsat imagery and so forth. Because of that, we're able to kind of pull our biomass estimates into different cover types and really focus on the ones that we feel most comfortable with, and that's certainly tree cover. And this is all that's showing here is in the upper left is different land cover classifications that exist. This is based on classification of Landsat imagery. Below that is showing the map I showed you earlier. And then we basically break that down pixel by pixel into these different cover types. Now, I want to note that many of these cover types it's a satellite imagery classification. So a model's been used to say, what do we think this is? And we know from our LIDAR information that those classifications, they're good, but they're not perfect. And so there's actually a lot of, for example, lake shoreline and riparian areas that are classified as water, according to this, where we actually know that there are trees. And that's because the resolution of our LIDAR is 1 meter, essentially, and the resolution of these maps is 30 meters. They're chunkier. And so we don't really believe that there's a lot of biomass in the water. We know it's 0, but our maps are actually able to pick up the shoreline vegetation. And so there's some interesting questions about what's truth here or not. Point being is that we can really start to look at how the biomass breaks down into different areas and with different levels of confidence in those different types of land covers. Right now, we've been able to do this for all the areas that we process LIDAR for the state. And you can see this kind of patchwork coming together. All of this has been updated using land cover information. This is 2019. We recently just got the 2020 land cover and updated it. I need to update my slides, but you get an idea here. The maps are showing a scale of light green to dark green for biomass, except in developed areas and water, where we've pulled those out and we're showing those separately in the map as red and blue respectively. So we're waiting on more LiDAR. This has been delayed. And just to give you a sense of how that fills in the puzzle piece, we do have the yellow area shown here, and we're processing that right now, and we'll be bringing that into our models. But we're really waiting on the gray area, which has huge chunks of forest land in Delaware, Sullivan, Greene counties, and especially in Hamilton County in the Adirondacks. And those the FIA plots that exist there are going to be really valuable to adding to our training set and our testing set for these models. And so that's what we're waiting on. So right now, I can tell you that we've tested in many ways the accuracy of these maps. And our own estimates suggest a mean bias of less than 5 metric tons of above ground biomass per hectare, and which is very, very accurate. My friend and colleague at the Nature Conservancy, Michelle Brown, who leads their natural climate solutions team for New York, did some ground truthing of some of these data with on their own TNC parcels with their own forest inventory. They do very intensive forest inventory on their parcels, and she found errors of no greater than 10%, and she found some errors that were between 1 and 5%. And so we found that these maps are actually quite accurate at parcel scales, which is exciting, but they're just a snapshot in time. They don't get us to understanding the changes over time, which is really what we need to understand sequestration. This is this idea of a stock change approach. If you measure the stock at one point in time and you compare that to the stock at another point in time, you can look at how that stock has changed. If the forest carbon stock has increased, then we can infer that the system is sequestering carbon, is removing it from the atmosphere. If the carbon stock has decreased, we can infer the opposite, that it is a net emitter of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. And so that's how we use a stock change approach. And what our task here is to try to bring that into a map space, which very few other groups have tried to do, because it's really challenging in part. So the second piece of this is to go back in time retrospectively and do a historical stock change analysis to look at how the forest carbon sink has changed since 1990 and what has caused these changes. And essentially to do this, we're using the LiDAR-based biomass maps that I've already shown you, but we only have LiDAR for those points in time, and there's a lot of intricacies with it. What we do have that takes us back in time on a consistent basis is Landsat, satellite imagery. And so if we create models that use Landsat imagery to train a model on the AGB map, so what does the imagery look like for these different areas where we've estimated AGB? We can then use those models to analyze the historical Landsat imagery and produce annual 30-meter maps similar to the ones that we've already produced with LiDAR, but this allows us to do it at very large scales on an annual basis going back in time. We could go back to 1986 when Landsat was first online, but we really only need to go back to 1990 for carbon accounting purposes. Again, 1990 is that baseline emissions for New York State. We do a lot of map accuracy and bias correction and a lot of other data operations, and then ultimately estimate changes over time per pixel and per group of pixels. And a group of pixels could be, right, an area like a parcel or a management unit. So just to give you a sense of the translation between the models and what they output, the LiDAR AGB map that I showed you earlier is here. When we train a Landsat model to replicate the same area, we see some similar patterns and we see some differences between the two data sets. Quantitatively, they reproduce things in an area basis pretty well, but there are some important differences. LiDAR contains a lot more information, and the LiDAR maps are more accurate. Landsat really is basing its when we base predictions on Landsat, it's based on this idea of greenness, and forests only get so green, and so the Landsat tends to saturate at higher levels of biomass. It doesn't. Forgive me, I said that wrong. LiDAR saturates at higher level of biomass. Landsat isn't as good as predicting higher levels of biomass as LiDAR is, but we have to make some trade-offs in order for us to go back in time. What this allows us to produce, and hopefully this will work, is a time series map of any area that we want to map on a year-by-year basis, showing us the changes in forest biomass over time. And so in the upper left-hand corner, you can see the years clicking off as we go through. Now I've shown some of these animated maps, it's cycling back now into the 90s. I've shown some of these animated maps to some forest landowners like Lime Adirondack and Mulpus Woodlands Group and F&W, and they get a kick out of it because they can see their operations going in various places on the landscape. And so we have the ability to observe historically changes that have occurred, as well as this feeds into our monitoring approach. We'll zoom into a working forest here, and this is just a single tile from our maps, and this is immediately west of Huntington Forest. The red line moving through there is Route 28N. That's the county line flow, is the major body of water there in the middle of the map. And this is former Finch Prine land. For some of the time series that I'm showing you, it was Finch Prine land, and now it's managed by F&W Forestry for ATP. You can see as we go through this on the right, showing the total biomass stock in this area, the harvests that occurred in 2009 and 2010. So we can summarize this numerically, but we also have the ability to view it in a map space. And again, it's cycling back through this time series to be able to observe the harvesting, the spatial dimensions of the harvesting, as well as the regeneration that's occurring. And there are some caveats to this, particularly the immediate regen is faster in our models than it is in reality. And we know this is something that we're working on. In fact, we're using a lot of data from Huntington Forest and other places in terms of the regeneration patterns. We're also working with a lot of these landowners who are sharing their data with us to better understand regeneration rates and patterns. But the point here is that we can track this over time at a scale that's relevant for parcels. And I hope this video is coming across okay in Zoom and making sense. If you think about it, what we've done is essentially created, sorry, I jumped ahead, a stack of maps. And these are all raster maps. So there's a value for each 30 by 30 meter pixel or grid cell. And when we stack them together like this, we can go through the stack in a variety of ways to look at changes over time. And the simplest thing to do for a stock change analysis from 1990 to 2019 is subtract one from the other. And so if we subtract the 1990 stock estimates from the 2019 stock estimates, we can get this net change at a 30-meter resolution over time. What's nice about having all the yearly data is we can also pick out some specific things. So to translate this to on the ground, the area that I showed you before is highlighted here. And so the large body of water here is Long Lake. The other large body of water here is Catlin Lake on Huntington Forest. And this is showing the area that we already zoomed in on. So essentially I've taken the net change in biomass and I've superimposed it here just on ortho imagery to hopefully situate yourself a little bit better. When we look at this back in the GIS format, we can look at this AGB change with the brown areas in terms of biomass loss, and the kind of bluish green areas is biomass gain. And you can already start to see some of the parcel boundaries popping out here. And what's cool about the annual analysis is we can analyze this in detail to really understand what happened across the landscape and when. And so we can look at that 1990 to 2019, but we can also break it down into decades. So what happened between the 1990s and 2000s, 2010s, and so forth. We can identify the years in which different harvests go in, when those harvest operations took place, or whenever those losses, whatever they were caused by, took place. And so in the bottom right here, it's just showing our estimated year of biomass loss, at the same time that in other parts of the landscape, we're accounting for the biomass gains and the net carbon sequestration that's occurring as harvested forests regenerate. And so we have this holistic and spatially explicit sense of what's going on out there over time. Just to show you some other areas here, maybe some of you have skied at Gore Mountain, which is right in the middle of this map here. We actually can pick up when they put in their new ski trails in the early 2000s. Those are showing up as orange lines in the middle of the map here. Hopefully you can see my cursor. This is the Hudson River passing through North Creek. And if we follow the Hudson River down further to Warrensburg and Lake George, we can see areas of really those orange kind of reddish areas are places where either we had clear cutting go on or we had forest removal and conversion to some other land use. But we also see a lot of biomass increases throughout the landscape in different parts. And so we're able to do this at a very large scale. Again, here's this AGB change map for this large area of the Adirondacks. You can see very little change. That's the kind of grayish area, very little change going on in the High Peaks Wilderness, which is the northern area of this map. And some other areas with relatively little change, but showing this is a landscape with some increasing biomass and some decreasing biomass over this period of time. And if you sum all of these pixels up, the pluses and the minuses and all of them, the answer is remarkably close to zero, which is not what policymakers want to hear, but it's what the data says. And so the carbon sink here is holding, but it's not strengthening. So based on all of this work, we can also monitor the landscape going forward. So just as if we have looked at it going backwards using Landsat imagery and models, right, to give us a sense of of what's going on in the landscape, we can ingest or take new Landsat imagery and FIA data and add years on to that stack of maps, 2021, 2022, and so forth, as time goes forward. And as soon as we get the imagery, we can process it and we can provide not a real time, but a near real time sense of what's happening out there and what's happening in the most recent past. And so our baseline approach for monitoring relies only on new Landsat imagery and FIA as it becomes available. Anything can happen, right? If we've learned nothing over the last couple of years, anything can happen, right? But we're pretty confident that the Landsat program or something equivalent is going to continue, and that the FIA program is going to continue. And so we built our baseline monitoring system on that foundation. And of course, the models that we'll continue to train and improve and refine. We're exploring and testing use of the wealth of other remote sensing data that's out there, including radar, spaceborne LiDAR like JEDI, and hyperspectral imagery, higher resolution imagery from satellites like Sentinel. There's a whole lot of stuff that's emerged in the last decade, especially, that's really powerful and can probably give us more information. But there's also a degree of value to having a consistent baseline approach, so that you know that what you saw in the 90s, right, there's a comparability to what you're seeing going forward now and across that whole time series. The last thing I want to mention for today is there's a difference between observing the landscape and understanding what we actually see. And I want to stress, like, I'm an ecologist, there is no substitute for field work, right? But field work at these scales is implausible. I mean, it would be wonderful to have the budgets and have the kind of people that we would need to employ to put out in the field to do this kind of thing, but it's simply just not feasible, right? So we need to be able to understand what we see. And this is where ground truthing comes in. And this is where change detection really comes in. There are a number of tools out there for detecting change in landscapes and trying to parse out a signal, real changes versus noise in source data, quality of imagery, and other things. And the three approaches that we've focused on are existing tools called LandTrender, CCDC, and LCMS. They essentially do a pixel by pixel analysis of Landsat imagery over time using a standardized Landsat, ARD stands for Analysis Ready Data. It's all available on Google Earth Engine. It allows tracking back to 85 or 86 and also tracking forward with new imagery. And these tools try to identify abrupt breaks or changes in patterns that indicate a disturbance. And so we've evaluated these against harvesting information that we know. So this is actually NAPE imagery from Huntington Forest, from the Sucker Brook area, from demonstration harvests that Bruce Breitmeyer and Mike Gooden and colleagues at ESF are responsible for. And so we have this beautiful imagery that we can use as a reference. On the left is showing what these tools output related to that area from Landsat imagery, which is not as high resolution as NAPE, but gives us an idea of when these different harvests are put in and how these different tools reflect the disturbances that are observed on the landscape, and the differences in pattern and the differences in timing that may be associated with different harvest operations or stand-in trees. And the work that we're doing is really now, I just have a proposal that we submitted to support some more work in training a forest change detective, because what we found is when we ground truth these tools against about 43,000 hectares of records from F&W forestry, from the Upper Hudson Woodlands, which area we've already looked at, as well as ESF's Huntington Forest, what we found is that these tools are not ready for prime time. And particularly, they're pretty bad at detecting the partial harvests like shelter woods and thinnings that are most common in the kind of northern hardwood systems of New York. And this is because they haven't been trained for the Northeast at all. These tools were developed mostly for Pacific Northwest forests or southern even age plantations, and they're not designed, and they haven't been trained or tuned or calibrated or what have you. They're algorithms, and like musical instruments, they perform best when tuned, right? And so they need to be tuned, and that's the work that we're trying to do going forward. And particularly important to try to parse out harvest disturbances from other causes of canopy loss or biomass loss, especially as insect pests start to move through this region, as they've already moved through much of the state of New York, sadly. The Adirondacks is, doesn't have a lot of ash, but emerald ash borer is moving in. Adirondacks does have a lot of hemlock, and hemlock oleodelgid has also been found in the region and is expected, although some of this cold weather should hopefully slow it down a little bit. So what we found is that the tools that exist now are not going to cut the mustard, and especially are not going to treat working forests fairly. What we do think is when we look at a place like the Adirondacks, where we have working lands, where we have research and demonstration lands, and where we have reserves, like the Forest Preserve, the High Peaks Wilderness, there are very different patterns of disturbance that we can detect from satellite imagery. And we think based on the land use and ownership, and looking at these patterns, that we can train models to detect the patterns or to recognize these patterns so that we understand the changes and what looks like a natural disturbance or what looks like a harvest disturbance. In the High Peaks Wilderness, harvesting is strictly prohibited. There's probably some firewood logging, right? But for the most part, these disturbances, we're pretty confident if they exist, and we want to do field work to recon them, but if they actually took place, that these are natural disturbances. These are not harvest disturbances. Whereas at Huntington Forest, we know with detail where things have been harvested and where they haven't. And similarly, for our partners at Upper Hudson Woodlands, as well as now with Lime Adirondack, who's going to be sharing about 93,000 hectares of records with us, and with Mulpus Woodlands Group, we're working on that agreement with them right now. Between Lime and Mulpus, those are the two largest private landowners in New York State. And we're going to have, I think, an unrivaled ground truthing data set to be able to try to create some better tools for change detection and this idea of causal attribution. What caused the change? Because bugs are going to be killing trees on working lands. Extreme weather, as it intensifies, is going to be killing trees on working lands. Working landowners should not be assessed for harvests they did not conduct, especially as this landscape of climate solutions, no net loss of forests, and all of these things start to really intensify in New York and the region. So to wrap up, this overall approach is what we've taken to both map things now and look backward in time and look forward in time to provide a really data-rich platform for applying this information to decision-making in both public and private sector spaces. And right now we're working with DEC's Lands and Forest Division to jointly develop applications of these data, for example, to prioritize the purchasing of offset easements, or conservation easements, which the state already owns about 1 million acres in the Adirondacks, on working lands mostly, as well as to help inform the amendments to this New York State's forest tax law, which are being proposed and will likely be at least negotiated and moving forward in the next year or two under the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. The whole idea here is to hopefully encourage forest landowners to have confidence in the data underlying this, and that they will be more willing to engage in climate solutions that both benefit them and their bottom line, but also benefit their communities and help us address climate risk. And doing that largely through improved forest stewardship, as well as reforestation and other strategies. That's a lot to swallow. I hope everyone is still with me, but I'm going to end there. And thank you for your time and your questions. And I want to apologize. I think it was to John Howard, who raised his hand many times, that I saw a couple times here and there, for not stopping. But I wanted to try to get through all of that, and I'd be happy to answer your question first, and I'll also let Peter moderate the questions however he sees fit.
Great job, Colin. Thank you. So one of the fears of a host is like, oh no, there aren't going to be any questions. Well, that is not the case we have here. So they started about the second breath you took, and they have been just like flooding in. Okay. So I'm going to scroll way back. My mouse isn't scrolling. Holy smokes. So lots of great input and commentary, lots of people interacting. Some questions were kind of general and were responded to by other participants. So we'll go back to 1216, and Kelly says, well, so first, as host, it's my prerogative. So you when you're looking at the change in stock, you said that at least for that area that was the focus, and so maybe that's the difference, is kind of the geographic scale. But you said there's essentially a zero gain, and yet there's an anticipation of a 15%. So how does that, where did the 15% come from? Is that based on theoretical or on data? And what's the data that created the 15%? How does that compare to what you found, which was essentially a 0%?
So the 15% that FIA has presented is based on their national level calculations, comparing that to emissions, right? So they do a stock change that's aggregated to the state and then to the national level, right? So every year, as you know, they have reports back, right? Grant Domke and his team pull together reports from all the states and aggregate that up. So that's their 15%. It happens to coincide with the policy mandated directive by New York State, which is 85% reductions, 15% offsets, right? So the hard to decarbonize sectors in New York State, I don't know exactly how they came up with 15. It seems kind of convenient, right? But the idea that they need to offset 15% of that, when we look at the actual carbon offset that would require, the size of that, and we look at the current size of the carbon sink, we're looking at roughly having to double it in New York State, the strength of the carbon sink. When I added up all of those pixels to say that biomass changes were net zero across that area over that point in time, that is not to suggest that there isn't ongoing carbon sequestration. There is, and there's a tremendous amount stored in the soils. In fact, the forest preserve is a great kind of long-term bank for carbon storage. What I was saying is that there was relatively no net gain or loss over that point in time, as we could tell in terms of biomass across that area, because the removals kind of balanced out the gains. And so that is not what policymakers want to hear. And it is something that folks have been saying about the forest preserve for a long time. There are a lot of debates about young versus old forests and what sequesters carbon better. I don't want to wade into that necessarily here, although maybe it's unavoidable. But it is a significant consideration to think about. I think what it shows, and what I'd like to, I guess what I'll say is, New York has some unique land use regulations with the forest preserve, working lands, and particularly a place like the Adirondacks. It offers a really diverse portfolio of strategies to sequester and store carbon and provide a lot of the other benefits that forests provide us, right, which are just as important.
Okay. All right, well, I will start. Thank you for that.
Yep.
I will start working through these questions. Just so you know, there are, I'll guess, several dozen. So you can gauge the complexity and detail of your responses. So, so Kelly starts with, and you had mentioned that there is a goal to double the amount of carbon sequestered, and she wants to know if that's feasible for New York.
Ooh. I think it's going to take a big lift. I think that there's some things that we have to do in carbon accounting that gets to this, and this I hopefully gets to a lot of other folks' questions around harvested wood products, right? So currently FIA's approach, and they're working on this, but when they estimate removals or harvests, they estimate that all of that carbon is an emission to the atmosphere. And we know that harvested wood products don't lead immediately to emissions, depending on the product, depending on the supply chain and the end point of the product, right? There's carbon storage in durable wood products for long periods of time. There's also the substitution benefits of being able to use wood in place of fossil intensive products like concrete, plastic, and steel. And that gets to mass timber construction, incredible stuff that my colleague Paul Cravella is doing at ESF, because we can build very tall buildings efficiently, more cheaply, and definitely with a better carbon footprint. We can build them out of wood now. And there's amazing opportunities to consider there more broadly as a wood-based bioeconomy in terms of being able to convert woody feedstocks into fuels, liquid fuels like diesel and potentially even jet fuel. You're not going to electrify a 747 anytime soon. So and this isn't an area that I work as much in, but my colleagues in CAFRE work a lot in, and is thinking about those applications. I think we're going to have to start to consider bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and the relationship with our forests there. Now, nobody's talking about cutting down everything and putting it into pellets. That's not what we're talking about. But we do have a lot of forest land that is in difficult shape and needs a lot of stand improvement and restoration activities. We have huge parts of the state where landowners are dealing with a lot of low-grade material. They don't have markets to deal with it. And the pressure actually on them right now, especially in the lower Hudson Valley, is to sell to solar developers and wind developers. And the issue there, and I'm not against solar and wind, but clearing a forest to put in a solar farm is nuts, right? From given the amount of abandoned land that we have in the state, and from a carbon standpoint, it's crazy. And so I'm not, again, against solar, but let's not clear productive forest land or land that could be, with some investment, productive forest land. So we have a lot of forests with low-grade material. We don't have markets for that material, but if we can further develop markets for them through mass timber construction or other bioeconomy applications, like cellulose-based fuels, right? Then we have the opportunity to take this material as part of stand improvement efforts so that we can put our forest back on a better trajectory towards being more productive of not only wood products and carbon benefits, but of all the other things that we care about and all the other values that we have. I think you've got to put that whole picture together to even have a hope of having a carbon sink that big by 2050. The last thing I'll say about it is, even if it's a very ambitious goal, even if we miss, we can still make phenomenal progress. And I'm guessing, since all of you are on this call, more forests, healthier forests, more productive forests, better stewardship of our forests can result from that. And that's not a bad thing.
Okay. So John, who had raised his hand, and just so people know, I usually just turn off the hand raise just because that's what I do. But John has kind of a two-part question. One is, so this came in at 12:18. He's wanting to know, question one is, how do they reconcile the forever wild status of the Adirondack Park? And then at the other end of the spectrum is how they're going to include private forest land parcels less than 50 acres, which is a significant part of the New York State forest land base.
Right. That's a great question, John. I think at this point we were talking about New York's goals, right? And what the state is hoping to achieve. And the forever wild status of the forest preserve in the Adirondack Park presents, right, just like anything, some trade-offs. It is a mostly maturing forest. There are some areas that are younger. There are some areas that are older. From what we can tell, the rates of net sequestration in much of the forest preserve have slowed down quite a bit, but they haven't stopped. But they probably have slowed down a bit. Because there's no harvesting there, you're talking about the forest preserve as a long-term kind of storage bank, particularly as the forest moves through its natural gap-dependent processes, and you see, right, regeneration taking place and a lot of carbon being added to the soils. And so I tend to think of the forest preserve as a big carbon store. It's maybe not removing carbon as aggressively from the atmosphere as some more rapidly growing forests are. One of the challenges with the forest preserve as it exists right now is that stewardship activities are limited there. And as threats move into the area, and we've had a lot of stressors like acid rain and a number of other things over the years, there's going to be limited capacity, at least under the current regulatory and legal framework, to be able to address those stressors. Whereas on working lands, there's a lot more opportunity to do that stewardship. Now, as you mentioned, forest lands under 50 acres. I hope that what I showed you today gives you a sense of what we can do with smaller parcels, recognizing the smaller parcel ownership and that individual landowners, and not these big industrial landowners necessarily, although they obviously are important, but individual family forest landowners need, the state needs them to engage with this. And so we need to be able to understand what's going on their lands. As you might know, DEC has been wanting to push a harvest notification system for New York State. As you might also guess, people have not been enthused about that in the forest sector. And John Bartow at ESFPA has told me they'd rather be watched from space than have to report every time they do something. And so we're watching from space. One of the things that we're working on, and this last thing I'll say about small parcels, is uncertainty estimates for small area estimation. I would not want to use my carbon numbers for certainly my city lot in Syracuse, right? Although there are applications of what we've developed for urban forests. However, I feel pretty good about anything that's over 20 acres, but that's just where I am right now. I think what we need to do is understand better the uncertainty at different scales and in different parts of the state. And again, nothing substitutes for field work, but this data can be very helpful for prioritizing where we go in terms of easements, in terms of field inventory and other efforts. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. A different John wants to know if there's going to be pressure to homogenize forests, creating monocultures of faster growing desirable species in New York woodlands. So essentially, is there going to be, to accomplish the goals, is there going to be this pressure to do more like intensive silviculture, monoculture, plantation forestry?
I apologize. Can you repeat that one more time?
Sure. So is there going to be pressure to homogenize forests, creating monocultures and plantations? I'm inferring plantations,
right,
in New York to accomplish the sequestration goals.
I hope not. I don't see that happening. I think there may be pressure to manage some of the plantations or many of the plantations that have gone unmanaged across the state. As some of you probably know, we have a lot of civilian conservation corps, kind of New Deal era plantations around the state, a lot of Norway spruce and red pine and some Scots pine and some white pine in other areas. A lot of those plantations have not been managed. There could be some pressure to address those, in part because I think the silvicultural wisdom there is that they need some tending. I don't see pressure to homogenize. Now, on marginal and transitional lands, on abandoned agricultural lands, brownfields, which is another piece of work that we're doing that I didn't mention, but trying to map those areas across the state because everybody's looking at them for whatever their pet solution might be. There's the opportunity to introduce short rotation woody biomass crops like shrub willow as the first step of reforestation. We know that those store carbon in the soils and that they can be a bridge between an abandoned field full of invasive shrubs and a regenerating young forest. But the short rotation crops are just one potential solution in the mix here. And those are the only ones that I've really seen. Those are the only ones that would follow under the qualification of a monoculture, but that's a short-term land use to kind of sequester carbon, generate feedstocks while you transition the land through underplanting of more shade-tolerant trees to regenerate a more of a natural forest. Those also give us the opportunity to do some assisted migration and move some species into our landscape that may be slow to migrate, but we know will probably enjoy the climate of the future. So some of the mid-Atlantic species, and particularly thinking about oaks and hickories, and my favorite of all, sweet gum, which I grew up with in Virginia. I'm hoping sweet gum becomes the red maple of New York State. I know everybody just cringed, but I think sweet gum could be one of those trees that moves in to some of the spaces that we're going to lose some of our other more cold adapted species, or those that are being whacked by insects.
Okay. Eric wants to know if the LIDAR data sets are publicly available.
Eric, yes, they are through the New York State GIS Program Office. And I definitely need to give them a shout out because they compiled this repository of LIDAR data that we are leveraging here. And without their work, this wouldn't been possible for us, I think, or we would have had to do a lot of legwork to track everything down. The other thing I want to mention is that the same office has compiled statewide the tax parcel boundaries and records, and gotten a few recalcitrant counties down in Long Island in particular to participate in this program. And through an MOU that I have with them, I have all the tax parcel data too. So if you can imagine the maps that we produced, I can overlay all the tax parcel information. It's a pretty powerful basis to be able to look at what's going on in different places. And I hope in part to be able to serve landowners by being able to provide them with maps that might be useful for stewardship purposes.
Okay. Linda wants to know how much, if at all, the forest understories contribute to carbon storage and sequestration.
Linda, that's a great question. We are actually going back and forth on this a lot with our colleagues and collaborators at FIA about whether to include understory. As someone who arrived in New York at Newcomb at Huntington Forest and saw very firsthand immediately and learned a lot from folks about beech bark disease and the impacts that beech have had on our forest structure and productivity, and being privileged to spend a lot of time with Ralph Nyland in the field, as well as folks like Peter Smallage and others, right? We know that understory beech thickets can comprise a lot of the biomass of our stands. It's also useful maybe for us to understand where they are on a broad scale if we can try to address them. The question of whether they contribute or not is a good one. In a forest without issues like that, they're relatively small contribution. There's some sniggly details about how we use those understory micro plots from FIA, and we've explored some of that space. I do think that in areas, particularly in the Adirondacks, where beech thickets are a very significant problem, they probably do comprise a very non-trivial, a significant portion of the biomass of the stand. I think we're getting at that somewhat, but we could probably take a deeper dive there and better estimate that.
Okay. As we were continuing our downward trajectory, Hayden wants to know about below ground biomass, whether that's incorporated into the inventory or if it's estimated, and how significant it is to either include it or exclude it when we're thinking about carbon statistics.
Thanks, Hayden. This is a really important question, and I apologize because I think I skipped over this very important piece. So above ground biomass is what we can remotely sense and track the best. It is only one of the 5 carbon pools that FIA keeps track of, right? So there's above ground biomass, below ground biomass, deadwood, litter, and soils. Based on FIA's data, we can, with some confidence, use our above ground biomass estimates to then estimate below ground biomass, litter, and deadwood. As I mentioned, soils is a whole nother can of worms, and a real big gap. Not just in an applied way, but our basic knowledge of the kinds of soil carbon storage, how persistent or how labile that carbon is under different climate scenarios, how land use changes, how management affects soil carbon. It is in a lot of ways really a hole in our knowledge that needs to be addressed, and I'm excited that my colleagues, at least in New York State and in the region, Greg Lawrence at USGS and Ivan Fernandez at Maine, have started a Northeast soil monitoring cooperative that we're hoping to get some momentum under to address some of these questions, at least for the Northeast. But what we essentially will do with these biomass estimates is convert them to carbon for those 4 pools and CO2 equivalents for those 4 pools: above ground, below ground biomass, litter, and deadwood. And then the soils again is a huge can of worms, and it's a very important one. And I think when the operating assumptions that we're working on right now, which may or may not be good assumptions, but it's kind of what we have to work on right now, is forests remaining forests. We tend to think of, even if they're managed, as relatively stable carbon soil carbon stocks. When land use change occurs is when we're most concerned with the loss of soil carbon stocks. But that's as much as I'm willing to say right now. But it is a big question.
Okay. David and Rupert offer comments on soil carbon that are consistent with what you were just saying. So,
absolutely, agreed.
Let's see. All right, so back to Kelly. You had mentioned using the change in above ground biomass And she and some others say, I'm not
Yep.
sure you can infer that a decrease in forest stock is equivalent to a carbon emission. And you mentioned this earlier in your comments. She's raising the question about harvesting the storage of harvested wood and durable wood products. And then there were 2 or 3 other people that also were commenting on that.
I agree, and this is part of the challenge with any of these methods, right? So, the stock change methodology makes some assumptions. Part of the reason why we've kind of gone into the change detection work, one of the things that we're working on is actually being able to estimate harvest intensity based on some of the outputs of these algorithms. We've had some early success doing that. But you're absolutely right. We've got to account for harvested wood products, right? And what the fate of that carbon is. And this is a project that we have funded through the support of New York State Ag and Markets to CAFRE, as one of several projects that Ag and Markets funded, including Peter's slash walls, which is really exciting, and fun to climb around on. But that is the analyzing. So one of the things that we are doing right now is really trying to do a detailed analysis on the carbon benefits of harvested wood products in New York State. As you can imagine, a lot of the data that we're producing in this project is going to contribute to that effort. But in that way, so that we have this other pathway, so that if a removal from the landscape occurs, right, we're not just treating it as an emission. And that's something that right now, some of the maps that I showed you, and that's why I said, Peter, when we add up all those pixels and they get to 0, right, it's not a full carbon accounting, because a lot of the areas that were harvested, right, that wasn't just pushed right into the atmosphere.
Right.
Right.
Okay. I'm not sure if you want to field this question. John points out there's a lot of discussion about increasing management, addressing forest health, addressing invasive species. If the state, so here's the question, if the state doesn't have enough resources to do this now, how will it do more of this in the future?
Excellent question, John. And just for full disclosure, John is one of my advisees at ESF, and very one of my favorite students. And I would say this is a great question. So I often talk about that we are asking our forests to do a lot for us right now, at a time when they are beset on all sides by all kinds of challenges and stresses. We are going to lose a lot of carbon stock due to emerald ash borer. We already have, and a lot of sequestration potential. We're going to lose a lot to hemlock woolly adelgid, and whatever, Asian longhorn beetle, whatever the next one is, right? I mean, I'm nervous about spotted lanternfly eating all the hops, but that's a different thing, right? So, but with climate change, the legacy of acid deposition, the legacy of maybe some past management practices that were ill-advised, or maybe too market-driven, right? With beech bark disease, with the insects, the pathogens, with everything that's going on. No state in the country has more invasive species than New York, right? With the challenges that we have with deer impacting regeneration, right? It's not as if we're going to our forest land. I mean, almost 2/3 of the state is forested, but a lot of that forest land is in rough shape. And I say that not to be critical, but to recognize that this is a landscape and an ecosystem, broadly speaking, that needs a lot of stewardship, just on principle, but especially if we're going to start to address these goals. So if we want to increase the strength of the carbon sink, we've got to do a lot of this stuff to try to enhance the trajectory that a lot of our forests are on. And the folks downstate don't want to hear it, but the reality is that it's going to involve some harvesting. It's going to involve some management. But management offers the opportunity to try things, to do stewardship activities. We have roughly 4 million acres of land in the state that is constitutionally protected as a forest preserve. And by some standards, maybe that's not enough. Maybe other standards, it's too much. But that's kind of your principle that's in the bank in some ways. And so I think that there's a lot of different opportunities here, but it is going to be a very significant lift. If we don't solve the climate problem with our forests, like I said before, we can make some progress to it and hopefully at the same time improve our forests. And the actions that we take now are really going to bear out for our grandchildren, right? And for the generations that come afterward. So I think that it's a huge challenge. It's an absolutely staggering challenge, but it's one I think if we can get the policymakers and the people of this state and elsewhere in this country to start paying attention to forests and their values again, then I think that it's a good challenge to take on.
Still another John commenting or question. Have you compared your results from Lidar to FIA's Big Map project? And there's a link here to a Story Maps website that's working to improve the accuracy and resolution of the older low resolution wall-to-wall maps that FIA put out.
Yes,
So
yes,
Big Map.
we are. Yeah, so we have a map agreement or map accuracy analysis that compares our outputs to FIA at many different scales, including some of the aggregations that they've done in the hexagons with Big Map. And so I don't work as much with Ty Wilson at FIA as I do with Grant Domke, but we're heading down that road of being able to, now that we've got a whole set of products and models that until we get that big chunk of LiDAR, the models are pretty stable right now in terms of we're not making big changes. That we're going to be producing pixel level uncertainty and hexagon level uncertainties, as well as the multi-scale FIA comparisons that we do, which is based on Rachel Raymond's approach, where they do plot to pixel comparisons and then they scale those up to multiple kind of different nested hexagons. And what we've overall seen from those results is pretty good agreement. The big sticking point with that is, as I think you know, FIA is working to account for land use and land cover change. And there's many different data sets out there, and they have access to stuff that we don't have access to. So they have access to the NRI data set, even though they have to fight for it, even though it's USDA, it's a different office. But they have access to the natural resource inventory points, which is a much bigger system, not as detailed as FIA, but gives a sense of land coverage. So we're working with them, really collaborating with them, because of course their data is the backbone for everything we do. It's also important that we're able to compare when we go from a small area estimation to larger areas and we aggregate our maps up. How do they compare relative to what FIA would predict for the same area? We need to be able to crosswalk our maps and data with what FIA is reporting to the EPA for the greenhouse gas reporting program at the national level. That's not going to change. But working with them has been really fun because we're thinking about ways to bring FIA, and this is Big Map as an example of this, into the 21st century with all of the remote sensing opportunities that exist.
Okay. So Gay wants to know whether or not the Nature Conservancy and Family Forest Foundation are working with you to help those groups make their carbon program more accessible to private landowners.
I would welcome that opportunity. As I mentioned, Michelle Brown is involved in a technical advisory capacity in this forest carbon assessment project. Michelle's also one of the first friends and colleagues that I met when I came to New York in 2007. And she does amazing work with her team. And I know that there's a big push in this front. She's aware of all of this data. And so I'm hoping to be able to engage there and help however we can. I haven't done much yet, but we've talked about it.
Okay. Then there were, skipping over some comments about solid waste and mass timber and concrete and steel construction. Brittany's with TNC and willing to make some introductions if you'd like.
Cool. Thank you, Brittany.
Let's see. So Hayden wants to know how automated this study has become or will become, and whether you could essentially take those protocols and apply it to other states or to the whole country. Just what's the kind of transferability?
So Hayden, the models that we have that are based on Landsat, as you can imagine, we can go beyond the New York State boundaries, and I think I would feel comfortable doing that for analogous systems, particularly as we would look in the neighboring states, potentially even, dare I say, in Canada. And you know, but I think there's a lot of work to do our diligence there. There's a lot of conversations that we're having within our team. And Michelle is one of our advisors, John Battles, who built the CARBS, California Air Resources Board carbon accounting system, is also on our team and as a technical advisor. And we've talked a lot about, how confident we feel about estimating carbon in different places and different cover types. There's nothing stopping us from taking Landsat in Vermont and New Hampshire and other parts of New England or Pennsylvania and running it through the same models and providing at least something as a straw dog, right? To look at and to consider and to ground truth. And, I need to circle back with the folks at the US Climate Alliance. There's a lot of different groups working on this. Dan Hayes has a really nice project going in Maine. With Aaron Weiskittle and others. There's a lot of other groups working. Chris Williams at Clark does amazing work in this space. There's a lot of other groups that, of course, I'd be remiss to not mention the folks at Maryland, George Hurt and Ralph Devias carbon monitoring system. And then there's the whole Lemma group at Oregon State and at University of Washington, those folks out in Pacific Northwest. However, I'd be happy to engage with those and explore those opportunities. Because I'm kind of a multiple models guy. I haven't showed you all of this, but we have many different models. And in fact, the predictions that I showed you and the maps that I showed you actually come from ensembles of machine learning models. So I'm somebody who likes a lot of different models and alternative hypotheses and likes to bring together the information that we get from different models to try to understand and predict these systems. But yes, we could expand it outward pretty easily. I think the question would be, what's that worth? And would we have the ability to do the kinds of diligence that we need to do so that folks in those areas would feel confident? We could ground truth against FIA. I need to expand my material transfer agreement for plot locations for outside of New York State. But I think that there's some things that we could do in a relatively short order there if folks in neighboring states or regions were interested. I wouldn't want to take it down south, and I sure as heck wouldn't take it out west of the Rockies without a whole set of retraining efforts,
Okay. So there are some comments that were a little bit outside the scope of the presentation about, what trees to plant in the future and things. So I'm just skipping over those, but I just call and so I've saved all of the chat and I'll send that to you so that if you're interested, you can see all those details. Lauren wants to know what kinds of input from the FIA plots were used in the initial model. So what's, I guess, kind of the interface.
Right. So FIA, there's a few things that we do to select FIA plots, and it's something I completely skipped over. But some of the work that we're doing there, according to FIA folks, is somewhat groundbreaking. We're very careful about which FIA plots we use to train our models, because as you know, every plot in New York is sampled every 5 years. And so the timing of the Lidar flight needs to coincide with the timing of the inventory for us to have the highest level of confidence. But then that leaves us with a pretty paltry training set, because we're also only working with forested plots. We're working with some non-forested plots where we've actually used the Lidar to confirm that there is no vegetation there, or that the vegetation is under 1 meter in height. Because we do need the model to recognize zeros, right? And it needs to be able to make zero biomass predictions. But when we work with the FIA data, we clip the Lidar. There's positional accuracy issues. That's one of several sources of error. But essentially, FIA provides a tree by tree estimate at the subplot level of above ground biomass. And so those are based on the component ratio method, allometric equations. They take the DBH of the tree, the height of the tree, and the species. They estimate the above ground biomass of that. So we sum those up across all of the subplots that are forested within the total plot. And we aggregate the LiDAR point clouds that we've clipped from around those areas. We derive a whole bunch of metrics from that, and we use that for training. We added to our FIA sample size by considering FIA plots where there was an inventory before the LiDAR and after the LiDAR. So the LiDAR year didn't match the inventory year, but we have inventories that bracket the LiDAR year, and the inventories suggest to us or indicate or tell us really that there was less than a 5% change or net decrease in biomass between the first time period and the second time period. And then we interpolate that those between that to match the year when the LiDAR was flown. So we're doing some things to be very careful about which FIA plots we use to train our models. And we have to throw out a lot of data from model training in order to do this. And I think that we're the only ones that are being that kind of obsessive compulsive about it. And I think that has something to do with the accuracy of what we're pushing out. It could be totally unrelated, but I think that it's really helping. In turn, that's helping FIA consider more about what's true about their plot information and how some of the LiDAR, particularly products that we're pushing, are helping them understand their plots and how they may approach some of their own remote sensing work. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Just scrolling down, there are dozens and dozens of people saying various iterations of great job.
Thanks.
One person said it was the best carbon talk he's ever seen.
Oh man. I hope I do that well tonight at 7, Peter.
You will, I'm sure. Okay, so I'm scrolling, skimming quickly. I'm not seeing, there's some comments, but not questions. Here's one. Sally wants to know, what are your recommendations for balancing the amount of younger forests that's sequestering carbon versus older forests that store carbon?
Oh, wow. I guess I would say, you know, and not to punt on it, but we want more forest, right? And we want forests that are on good trajectories, especially the younger forests are those that are having issues with regeneration, with invasives, with a number of other challenges. Really, it comes down to the landowner. I could say whatever I want from my office in Bray Hall in Syracuse. You know, and others of my colleagues have been very engaged in saying you have to have young forests, you have to have old forests. It really comes down to what the landowners are going to do, right? And my concern, and again, I apologize if I'm sidestepping your question, but my concern is that if we limit options for landowners, if markets continue to dwindle for landowners, at least in New York State, and those options continue to dwindle, then their only option left is going to be to sell some or all of their land, which is going to lead to parcelization, fragmentation, and deforestation in a lot of cases. And that is the exact opposite direction that we need to go in. And so if a landowner needs to do management from a fiscal or other, for whatever purpose, then we need to understand the trade-offs associated with that management and what the likely carbon sequestration will be going forward. If a landowner decides to step back from active management, similarly, understanding those trade-offs. So really, almost 80% of the forested land in New York State is owned by private, is privately owned. And so really it's up to the landowners. And so I think some of this is about creating a space where landowners have more options and can engage with these programs, and that they're engaging with professional foresters, right? Trained at ESF or other places, even though we're the #1 forestry program in the country. I have to say that Renee Germain insisted that I tell everybody that, that we, that they're working with professional foresters to meet their objectives, and we hope that carbon and climate benefits can be included as some of those objectives. And so whether or not their objectives align to a younger forest or an older forest, or ideally a landscape that combines both, really, and I guess that's my really short answer is we want both. And we have the ability to do that across our landscape in some pretty powerful and innovative ways. We just need to put the resources and the attention behind it.
And I think that's a good place to stop. Also, we've run out of questions. So that, Colin, this was a gargantuan effort to respond to all of those questions. I don't remember a recent webinar that's had such interactivity. So that's to your great credit, and certainly to the credit of the audience. So I appreciate the still more than 100 people that are connected. So I want to thank Colin. For those of you who would like to see this presentation again, you can join us tonight at 7 p.m. Otherwise, we'll let you know about next month's webinar via email, and hope you can join us. Colin, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. Appreciate it.
Thanks to the audience. You all have a good afternoon.